today we've got two speakers who are going to take quite a sort of wide view of the relationship between sort of infections and the brain and our mental health, but also what the experience of living through a pandemic infection might do to us individually and us sort of more on a cultural level. So I first became aware of our first speaker a good few years before COVID, when I was interested in the neuropsychiatry of influenza. And Mark Honigsbaum has written some really wonderful books about pandemic infections and the sort of historical impact of those infections. He is a medical historian and a senior lecturer at City University. And he's published a number of excellent books, including The Pandemic Century, 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria, and Hubris, The Fever Trail, In Search of the Cure for Malaria, and Living with Enza, The Forgotten Story of Britain and the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918. And today he's going to ask a very, very salient question: what can we learn from the nervous sequelae of past pandemics?
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Thomas. Just going to get myself some water. Okay, just sort of check this. There we go. Okay, well, thank you so much, Thomas Pollock and the organising committee of the British Neuropsychiatry Association for inviting me to speak in this absolutely wonderful lecture theatre. Obviously, as a pandemic historian, I had a very busy pandemic. At the end of it, I said, I will never do a Zoom talk again. I've already broken that, but it's very nice to be here and actually interact with real people. So yes, the title of my talk is What Can We Learn from the Nervous Sequelae of Past Pandemics? This talk actually draws on research that I did about 15 years ago when I was writing a PhD at the Wellcome Centre for the History of Medicine, just up the road in Euston. I never thought it would be so relevant. So I'm sure I don't need to remind you that despite advances in the treatment of infectious diseases, nervous system involvement remains a challenge. This is particularly the case during pandemics, when it's difficult to know whether syndromes associated with novel viral infections have a somatic basis or are manifestations of underlying psychiatric conditions and/or wider social and psychological pathologies. And when you consider that in the case of long COVID, societal recognition of the syndrome can be traced to sufferers organizing online and is largely patient-made, then the stakes are even higher. On such occasions, we are reminded of the limitations of narrow biomedical models and the importance of listening to patient narratives of illness. And we're reminded of the value of looking to historical accounts of previous pandemics to understand how medical practitioners made sense of similarly protean neurological manifestations at a time when ideas of disease causation were in flux and demarcations between medical specialties were less rigid than they are today. So in what follows, I will focus on the 1890s. This is a period that coincided with a worldwide outbreak of a new respiratory disease, which was known as the Russian influenza. And this period contains a rich store of primary material for medical historians. And I'm going to be sharing some of the images from Victorian journals and periodicals. So the nervous sequels associated with the Russian flu included fatigue, depression, and mental prostration, and were given many names, including neuralgia, neurasthenia, nerve exhaustion, grip catalepsy, and post-grippal numbness. Asylum attendants also remarked on the frequency of what they called psychoses after influenza. These psychoses were characterized by feelings of paranoia and persecution, and not unlike the symptoms seen in cases of schizophrenia today. as well as hallucinations and various forms of disordered and delusional thinking. In the most extreme cases of all, the psychosis could trigger suicidal thoughts. And this is an extract from a short story that appeared in Strand magazine. This is, I won't sort of tell you everything about the story, but basically it concerns a doctor called Feverell. And in the short story that appeared in the Strand, the doctor is plagued with thoughts of suicide following a bout of Russian flu. And he thinks that he's precipitated the disappearance and death of a patient. And he's very, very alarmed, and he comes to another doctor, and he says that the influenza has left an extraordinary sequel behind. I have an inexpressible dread over me. By no means in my power can I drive it away. So as with long COVID, the sequels provoke lengthy disquisitions and disputes in the Lancet and other medical journals. For some practitioners, such as Julius Althaus, Harley Street neurologist who had studied under Charcot in Paris, the post-grippal psychoses were a, quote, new feature of the pandemic. For others, such as Daniel Tuke, the editor of the Dictionary of Psychological Medicine, the psychical derangements were, quote, as old as the influenza itself. Whatever the case, by the middle 1890s, the Russian influenza was being blamed for everything from the surging suicide rate to the general sense of malaise that marked the fin de siècle ebullition, and the image of a nation of convalescents, too debilitated to work or return to daily routines, and plagued with mysterious and erratic symptoms and chronic illnesses, had become central to the period's medical and cultural iconography. And I think this is very well illustrated by this image from Fun magazine showing the influenza fiend felling a burly London policeman. And you can see that, the caption there talking about, what chance has the ordinary mortal when 1,000 stalwart policemen have been bowled over by the fiend. So this is a remarkable illustration. You can stare at it forever and read all sorts of hidden meanings into it. So according to the Victorian throat specialist Sir Morrell Mackenzie, the influenza had a propensity to, and I'm quoting, run up and down the nervous keyboard, stirring up disorder and pain in different parts of the body with what almost seems malicious caprice. T.S. Clouston, the resident pathologist at the Morningside Asylum in Edinburgh and the editor of the Journal of Mental Science, concurred. Noting that 1890 was the first year in which admissions to the Edinburgh Asylum for depression had exceeded those for mania, Clouston observed that the Russian flu had, quote, left the European world's nerves and spirits in a far worse state than it found them, and that they scarcely yet have recovered their natural tone. So from a present-day perspective, this characterization looks decidedly odd. Today, influenza is regarded primarily as a respiratory disease, although it's known that A strains of influenza can trigger central nervous system complications. The pathogenic mechanisms are poorly understood. Moreover, few modern psychiatrists regard influenza as a trigger for psychosis. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. I believe that's the case. However, from the first epidemics of Russian influenza in the 1890s through to the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 1919, the psychosis of influenza was a widely recognized psychiatric category. There were also anecdotal reports of acute psychotic symptoms following the worldwide outbreaks of antigenically novel strains of influenza in 1957, 1968, and as recently as 2009 with swine flu. Unfortunately, unlike the H1N1 Spanish influenza virus, genes of which have been retrieved from archival autopsy specimens and sequenced in laboratory, viral material from the Russian epidemic has not been preserved, meaning that its precise genetic identity and its interactions with the nervous system can no longer be studied. Intriguingly, some scientists now suspect that the Russian influenza may be a misnomer, and that the pandemic may have actually been due to a human coronavirus closely related to one responsible for a bovine epizootic shortly before 1890. So if you're interested in this theory, these are just two screen grabs of articles that I posted online on my Substack. If you don't know what a Substack is, it's basically an online newsletter. You can reach it just by putting in that URL. And I discuss these theories in more detail. So, rereading the accounts of the nervous sequels that followed the Russian flu and the discussions in the medical journals, one should bear in mind that in the late Victorian period, ideas of infectious disease causation were in a state of flux, and laboratory medicine had yet to supplant older environmental and epidemiological understandings of epidemics. At a time when English physicians were skeptical of the new German bacteriological methods, a doctor's surgery was an important site for making and exploring new diagnostic categories, and the physician-patient encounter was charged with the possibility of discovery. Initially, doctors were suspicious of patients presenting with what struck them as hysterical nervous symptoms. A good example comes from the casebook of Dr. Samuel West, a respiratory disease expert and consulting physician at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. During the first wave of the pandemic in January 1890, West writes that the hospital's casualty department was besieged by more than 1,000 patients, quotes, clamoring for treatment. The vast majority were men, an unusual occurrence at a time when casual laborers were paid by the day and few workers could count on sick benefits. According to West, some of the male patients were so alarmed by their symptoms that they could recall the precise hour when they had been attacked, saying, quotes, "I went to work all right in the morning, but was suddenly taken ill at 11 o'clock and had to leave off." Moreover, once admitted to a ward, West writes that these patients could scarcely stand to have their lungs examined. And he writes, "All at once, all energy and vigor vanish. The patient feels for nothing and cares for nothing. Is completely apathetic, listless and gloomy, and may hardly have strength enough even to be irritable or sulky." And this is a picture which captures, I suppose, the sense of alarm and slight hysteria. You can see John Ball, the epitome of the Victorian Englishman, surrounded by these pesky microbes. I think there's some political statements embedded there as well. So during the initial phase of the pandemic, the Lancet carried similar reports, prompting one doctor to suggest that the flu ought to be known as, quote, influenza nervosa. And by 1895, Victorian newspapers were full of stories of patients who'd been driven to the brink of insanity and beyond by the influenza. So in all, some 4 million people in England and Wales were sickened during the 1889 to 90 wave of Russian flu. So it was called the Russian flu because the first reported outbreak had occurred in St. Petersburg in November of 1889. And it coincided with the expansion of the worldwide electric telegraph. So the reporters in Petersburg and other capitals in Europe telegraphed this news very rapidly to the UK and other parts of the world. 4 million people were sickened. This was followed a year later by a second, more severe wave in the spring of 1891, and that accounted for nearly 58,000 excess respiratory deaths. So really quite serious. One of the most alarming events occurred in the winter of 1892. So 1892 saw a third wave of illness, which was accompanied by something like 25,000 excess deaths. And one of the victims was the Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson, and the second in line to the throne. And this is a picture depicting his death. It appeared in the Illustrated Police News, which then went on to produce a special edition all about his funeral and scenes of grief and mourning. So taking into account a recrudescence of influenza in 1893, the Registrar General estimated that something like 125,000 Britons had perished in the pandemic. That's a total which approaches the mortality of the 1918-1919 Spanish flu. However, England and Wales also suffered further outbreaks in 1895, 1898, and it's even thought that an outbreak in 1889 at the end of that decade could have been flu. So that estimate could be an underestimate. There could be many more than had previously been counted. So further details of these late Victorian outbreaks can be found in my monograph, A History of the Great Influenza Pandemics, originally published by I.B. Taurus. It's now out in paperback from Bloomsbury, if you're curious. So I've said that initially Victorian nerve doctors were suspicious of these flu invalids. However, unlike long COVID, which disproportionately affects women, in the 1890s, the principal victims of the flu's nervous sequelae were men. This might explain physicians' willingness to compare influenza to neurasthenia, which, as you know, was a then very fashionable diagnosis. And rather than characterize male responses as a form of hysteria, a diagnosis which risked being gendered feminine, they characterize the nervous sequelae as somatopsychic responses to the shock of a primary focal infection and the excessive strain that this infection placed on the nervous system. The result was that by 1892, influenza noversa had been classified as a type of fatigue neurosis that, like neurasthenia, could be traced to overwork and overworry, key tropes of masculinity and modernity. So it's little surprise that before too long, Victorian nerve doctors were on the lookout for male convalescents with which to swell their practices and enhance their professional reputations. So one of these was Thomas Stretch Dowles. So Dowles was a consulting physician at the Hospital for Epilepsy and Paralysis in Regent's Park, but he also practiced in Welbeck Street. And he issued a book entitled On Brave and Nerve Exhaustion, brackets neurasthenia, and on nerveless sequelae of influenza, which ran to 4 editions, a very successful book. And Dowles in the book argued that, like neurasthenia, influenza was, quotes, an exhaustion disease, and he talked about it having a wizard-like effect on the nervous system. And I'm quoting now, patients tell us that they cannot sleep, that they become depressed and despondent, that they are rarely free from pain, and that they fail in energy, and that they get done up in a manner quite unaccountable. By contrast, Julius Altus was rather more skeptical of the parallels with neurasthenia. Instead, he speculated that the nervous sequelae were the result of what he called a grippal toxin combining with other diseases such as syphilis. This made sense given the association between syphilis and general paralysis of the sane, a common cause of admission to Victorian asylums at the time. Nonetheless, Altus was careful to avoid stigmatizing flu convalescents. Instead, comparing the nervous system to a galvanic battery that could become run down through excessive wear and tear, he ascribed their symptoms to nervous idiosyncrasy and recommended strong morphine-based sedatives coupled with nourishing food and rest, which is quite similar to the cure treatments that Beard was recommending at the time. So Altus was not the only physician eager to sidestep the issue of deeper psychological pathologies. In the winter of 1895, the then Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, suffered a debilitating attack of insomnia after a brief bout of influenza. The attack, which came at a difficult time for his government and coincided with dissensions within his cabinet, saw Rosebery confined to his country house at Epsom for 6 long weeks, during which time his friends became convinced that he had suffered a nervous breakdown. And I just wanted to share with you this wonderful illustration. So here you can see a cartoonist is satirizing typical male responses, different types of male responses. In the top right-hand corner, you can just see that poor Lord Rosebery suffered terribly from insomnia. So Rosebery's physician, Sir William Broadbent, blamed his condition on a stomachic derangement caused by his habit of reading while eating meals alone. And he continues, the result of this was that nervous power had gone from the stomach to the brain. It was only years later that Rosebery acknowledged how profoundly ill he had been, writing that his insomnia was, quotes, an experience which no sane man with a conscience would repeat, and that influenza had left him feeling like, quotes, a disembodied spirit. Similar symptoms of insomnia, accompanied by troublesome dreams, were experienced by Dowse's patients. Indeed, reading these case histories today, one cannot help but be struck by how, as in the Strand story, Russian influenza provoked profound feelings of Gothic doom and dread. And this is really a particularly memorable quote from Dowse's book on the nervous exhaustions of influenza. And he writes that I've seen men within 24 hours of taking the influenza sob like children for hours together, as though their hearts would break. This sense of gloom and dejection is a conscious living entity, as sad as Hades. The sacredness of life is seen only through a flimsy veil of conflicting emotions, of doubt, of dread, and of determination to burst these bonds by one fell swoop of severance from the mortal to immortality. Wow, I'm not sure if the prose there is that, but that's astonishing. Hopefully it wasn't using too much license. So today, the psychoses of influenza no longer warrant an entry in manuals of psychiatric medicine, having long ago been subsumed into the mood and personality disorders. This is a pity, for as the Strand story illustrates, and as Altus and Dowse's casebooks underline, such accounts are a valuable resource, not only for medical historians, but for psychiatrists and neurologists trying to make sense of present-day syndromes such as long COVID. So, as I'm sure I don't need to remind you, the cause of long COVID is currently unknown. Positive pathways include autoantibodies and fragments of viral RNA and proteins that linger in organs causing ongoing dysregulation. However, so far attempts to locate these biological markers have failed. As Avi Nath, a specialist in neuroimmunology at the NIH in the US puts it, quotes, the virus may be gone, but the music lingers. But what exactly is lingering? In discussion forums and threads on Facebook and Twitter, long COVID sufferers report rolling waves of symptoms, including fatigue, hallucinations, brain fog, delirium, memory loss, tachycardia, numbness and shortness of breath. To my ear, these threads recall the epistolatory dialogues of earlier influenza sufferers. One of the highest profile sufferers is Paul Garner, a professor at the Liverpool School of Medicine, Tropical Medicine, who developed symptoms of long COVID in March 2020. In his blog for the British Medical Journal, Garner has described, quotes, waves of illness and malaise, not dissimilar to the accounts of influenza convalescence in the 1890s. And this is an extract from his blog. I had a foggy head, acutely painful cough, upset stomach, tinnitus, aching all over, breathlessness, dizziness, arthritis in my hands, weird sensations in my skin, extreme emotions, they're bad, and utter exhaustion and body aches throughout. After 3 months, I was unable to get out of bed for more than 3 hours at a stretch. My arms and legs were permanently fizzing. Garner now claims to have recovered after controversially consulting a forum for ME sufferers and deciding that his symptoms were the result of, quote, a vicious cycle of dysfunctional autonomic responses stimulated by his subconscious mind. I'm not in a position to judge whether this explanation has any basis in science. I leave that to you. However, I do think it behoves researchers to take such reports seriously and not to dismiss them as a species of medical gaslighting. This is particularly the case given that, as Felicity Callard and Elisa Perego have argued in a recent journal article, long COVID has, quotes, a strong claim to be considered the first illness to be collectively made by patients finding one another through Twitter and other social media. In such circumstances, it's important to guard against any claim to epistemic authority. Rather, scientists need to remain alert to the ways that those outside of formal clinical channels seek to refine and contest knowledge produced within biomedicine, and recognize that how they engage with knowledge about new syndromes itself affects how meaning accrues to those syndromes. Such refocusing, I would say, is crucial now that the early mysterious days of the pandemic are behind us, and as it is clear that the coronavirus and its nervous sequelae are here to stay. As they adjust to the pandemic's longue durée, medical researchers might find it helpful to look back to the Russian influenza and the historical accounts of its nervous sequelae, even as COVID-19 long haulers look to patient-centered activist forums for support and validation in the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Honigsbaum. I think your talk today, together with Professor David's talk yesterday, should give neuropsychiatrists a pause to think that we do sort of forget the role of infections in neuropsychiatry at our peril. There were some real horror stories that were described yesterday morning as well. But it seems to be perhaps something that culturally we have a bit of an amnesia for. So thank you for reminding us. So any questions, please? I think we've got time for 2, possibly 3. Question over there.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Encephalitis lethargica, was there anything like that in these earlier pandemics, the Russian flu?
People didn't suffer prolonged, so the encephalitis, like, as you know, people fell into deep comas and wake up. Yes, so I haven't come across any accounts like that. The more common account was insomnia, actually, quite the reverse. So again, it's a mystery. I mean, we don't know precisely what whether the encephalitis lethargic speculated may have been due to the Spanish influenza virus somehow localizing in the nervous system. But there was a big gap, although symptoms of encephalitis were first recorded in, I think, around 1917-18 at the end of the pandemic. I think most of the big signal was in the later 1920s. So there's quite a gap there. But it's very hard to know the answer to these things without having, actual virus from the time.
One more question there.
I'm just interested in the topic, as you said, the exhaustion after influenza that's reported. And yet, we also hold aware that students who get glandular fever have prolonged periods of exhaustion afterwards. So it's not entirely been forgotten. Is there research going on now about what the ones we do know create exhaustion? What's going on?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. I mean, yes, I mean, if you look back, I mean, influenza has long been seen as a sort of disease where it's very dangerous. The medical advice in the 1890s and indeed before was, when we didn't have vaccines, there were really no treatment drugs. So the principal advice was to get plenty of bed rest. But, your typical sort of Victorian male professional, influenza has always been denigrated slightly. I mean, it still is today. I mean, how many times have you said it's man flu? I mean, it seems to me it's the last bastion of unwokeness, that men can be denigrated for having quite a serious illness. But I think that speaks very much to the way that influenza is this protein infection. And that, you know, if we think of seasonal influenza, we typically think of it either as, you know, a kind of like a bad cold, or an acceptable excuse for getting out of unwanted social and work engagements. But of course it has another side, which is pandemic strains of these viruses present almost like plagues with these severe pneumonias. And there's a lot of parallels there, I think, between influenza and long COVID. Coronaviruses also range from mild cold-like infections to these very, very serious life-threatening infections. And we've seen with COVID that people frequently suffer relapse, or they don't recover fully if they don't rest properly. And I think what's interesting to me about looking back in the Victorian period is you can see many of the same anxieties that are very present in our society, where, you know, we lead very regimented lives, you know, every portion of the day is allotted. You know, people find it very unsettling to actually be forced to take time out. And I can't help wondering whether a lot of the symptoms draw on the particular cultural materials that are present in that period. So the marvelous thing about influenza is it's kind of like, it sort of latches onto everything going on in the fin de siècle. You know, the sense of decay and degeneration that people felt at the end of empire, the way that everything seemed to be speeding up, the way that the information about the pandemic, just as in our time, we first heard about COVID-19, probably on Twitter, you know, or else on some news bulletin. It was the beginning of that sort of phenomenon was really in the 1890s, when we get newspapers telegraphing information way ahead of the arrival of this new disease. And it's striking that it was seen as hysterical, the initial reactions, because doctors said, well, look, people are reading too much about this in the papers. The Lancet, you know, admonished newspapers for exaggerating and overhyping it. But at the same time, they recognized that the dread, which could be, you know, a sort of emotional reaction to reading all the news, could also itself become part of the pathology. That's what I found quite fascinating about reading this.
Absolutely. I'm afraid we have no time for more questions. I could listen to Dr. Honigsbaum
Thank you very much
for the rest of the day, but thank you so much.